preventing you from getting to what you need. But it isn't good. The Naju isn't cooking the food. They aren't chilling the food. They aren't. They're simply addressing an obstacle that's preventing you from doing what you need to do.
So I don't. If I have this right, so how come I think we're not allowed to freeze something on Shabbos?
Right.
They want to freeze it for next.
Right.
Freeze it for next week or during the week.
The preparation.
You're not allowed to do that, but you can. But they can't.
You're right. There's another issue. Another issue with even if extinguishing the candle weren't problematic from a work perspective, it's problematic potentially for a different reason, which is you're preparing for the next week. So you're saying, well, if I can't, can I tell my neighbor if the purpose is to save the candle for next week? Is it an act of preparation? I don't think so, because I think if you're just talking about it, you're not actually doing anything. I don't think that's counted as preparation. I'm not 100% sure. So, because these things have, the idea of preparation, maybe from a moral perspective, like it says, for example, you're allowed to think about your business on Shabbos, but a pious person shouldn't do that, because on Shabbos we should view it as our work is done. But it's not a sin. It's not forbidden to think about work. So again, a pious person probably wouldn't say, "Oh, I need a candle for next week." But from a legal perspective, there is a precise definition to what's forbidden and what's not. And I don't think that asking someone to do something, it violates the technical guidelines preparing, because I'm not doing a physical action. I'm not 100% sure. It may be if you are. I don't know. I can't say 100%. Okay, I think it depends. The idea is about preparation. Okay, so anything that's supposed to prevent loss is okay. So if the item will not be any good unless it's frozen, you certainly let it do it, because otherwise it will be a loss. But we're talking about something that perhaps doesn't need to go into the freezer or doesn't need to go into the freezer yet. Would put it in the freezer naturally. So putting it in the freezer is really a preparation to use it at some later date. So why is putting it in the fridge okay? So the argument is that certain things are okay because they're not really preparation, they're just part of daily routine. Like if you take a bottle of milk out of the fridge and pour yourself a glass of milk, you don't have to leave it on the table because otherwise I'm prepared. You take it out, you pour the milk, you put it back. That's the way. Whereas freezing something is usually what?
What if I make a simple batch of cologne and
Let's,
it's still too hot to put in the freezer before it starts? Now, one of them is for Shabbos.
to prevent loss. To prevent loss.
And the other two are supposed to go in the freezer. That's okay?
Well, it's to prevent loss. If you leave it out, it's not going to be any good.
If you can put it in the refrigerator until.
So I don't know.
Sometimes it loses,
First of all, if you're holding the cookie in your hand, it's a question of you have to put it somewhere, because if you don't put it somewhere, it's going to get ruined. So now, are you required to open the fridge as opposed to the freezer? Because you're just opening one door or the other. It's hard for me to see that it's forbidden to put it in the freezer. It's not no additional effort involved. You're literally standing in front of a fridge freezer. So I've never asked anyone, but I would be surprised.
Well, why are you making a triple batch?
Why would you make just one?
Okay.
Every time.
I was going to say, why would you make just one? It's the same effort to
Right,
get three.
right.
Triple batch.
With the idea of on Shabbos.
No, with the idea of as soon as it cools, it goes.
But certainly, if you leave it outside for 24 hours, there will be a loss. So you have a license to put it away in the freezer. I don't think you're required to,
Especially in the summer.
right. I don't see why you would be required to put it in the fridge. Again, so if it were in the fridge, would you be allowed to take it out of the fridge and put it in the freezer? Maybe not. But now it's on the counter. You can't leave it out there for 24 hours. So you have a license to put it in the freezer to prevent loss. I don't see that there would be any reason. Now, if the freezer were 2 flights up and the fridge were right here, maybe there would be an argument that would be preferable. But I don't know.
Well, say one of the bedrooms that I have a guest and we forgot to turn the light off.
Yeah.
I could actually think to my non-Jewish neighbor to do it because I thought
It's certainly okay.
Like a shul, like a music, you could do it
No, certainly, if the non-Jewish neighbor turns off a light, then you can use the bedroom. That's not a question. Only question is how to communicate. So, the ideal situation would be if a non-Jewish neighbor was in your house and said, "Oh, the light's on. Let me turn it off for you." You didn't do anything. But since that is not likely to happen, you're allowed to facilitate. So how do you facilitate? So you're not allowed to ask them to do anything. And they say hinting. There's a term in the halachic literature called hinting, which that means basically, can you address the situation for me? Things like that, where you basically ask them to do something, but you don't quite know what you want them to do, but you are asking them to do something. But so that I think is more problematic, and it's not necessarily okay. But if you simply say, wow, the light is on, I can't believe I forgot to turn it off before Shabbos, what will typically happen is either they won't understand what you're trying to say, or they will say, "Oh, would you like me to turn it off for you?" So you have to be a little careful. But you at least had it before. We said, "Look, the same way I can't do it, I can't ask anybody else to do it." And they'll say, "Well, but if I do it, you'll be able to use it." Well, I mean, I would be able to sleep in the room, So usually, if the person is reasonably intelligent, they can figure out what you want them to do. We happen to have next door neighbors who are very easy. Oh, I work with Jews all the time. I know all about this.
That's great.
But you have to get them in your house first, so you can ask them to come over.
Yeah, you say, "Can you come over? Help us with." Can you say? Can you help us with something? No, saying you go to the door, you say, "Oh, I'm so sorry to bother you, but we have this trial. It's not the first time we've done this. I left the oven on, and the kids are in the house, and the oven's going to be on for the next 48 hours. We don't know. Oh, would you like me to come over? Well, we actually have some fresh blueberry cake on our counter. You can come and sample it. I think you can usually work it out.
Okay.
If they're the kind of neighbors that are willing to leave their house to help you, they'll be able to figure out what you want. And if they're not the kind of neighbors,
well, we have two people.
Yeah.
People,
And people are usually happy to help. That's one of the secrets of life, is that there's a lot of hatred and evil in the world, but when that's not activated, when people are just on their baseline, and if they're not currently engaged in any things to stimulate, people are usually happy to help out, like on a random. People
they aren't having a party or something.
Yeah.
They have to leave their guests.
Yeah. You try to make it worth their while, and then you offer them something, and if you have steak, there is. I think there's halachic underpinning to that, because in certain kinds of activities are permitted if a non-Jew is being paid. But for purposes of this discussion, these kinds of scenarios, it doesn't really address anything, because you're asking the person on Shabbos to do something they can do now. And the fact that you give them a piece of cocoa on the way out doesn't change anything. That's more of like if you have a cleaning lady who has a salary and she doesn't. So it may have in some way developed from that concept, but for practical purposes, it's a good idea. Okay. Anyways, so that's kind of the halachic overview. So we can explore this further, because I think we maybe didn't approach that in the most methodical fashion. But the reason why did it even come up now? So it says all activities from Shabbos have to be constructive in some manner, and construction is obviously constructive. Demolition is also constructive because it prepares for future construction. So it has to be demolition for the purpose of construction. So that's where intention matters. If you demolish something in a fit of rage, or that's not constructive. So the Gemara though asks the following query. Obviously, if you have a house and you're basically going to gut the house and expand it and redo the whole interior, that's constructive demolition. That's forbidden on Shabbos, according to Torah law. What if you demolish the house intending that you buy a 6-acre property, there's a house facing the street, you say, I don't want a house to be here. If I can afford to buy a 6-acre property, I can afford to level the house and rebuild it, 100 feet in, surrounded with trees, and it won't be visible from the street. So is that considered constructive demolition? On the one hand, yeah, I am planning to do construction and not being it's considered constructive demolition or just demolition, and the construction is going to happen as kind of unconnected piece. So again, there's plenty of that it will be prohibited on Shabbos anyways, but from a conceptual standpoint, is there a Torah prohibition in demolishing that house on Shabbos? So the Gemara says, well, look at we have their prototype in the Torah. Where was construction and demolition practiced by the Jews in the desert? Well, they constructed the Mishkan and they disassembled it every time they traveled. And when they disassembled it, it wasn't it had a purpose because they disassembled it the next stop. But by definition, they were not reassembling it in the same place. They were reassembling it somewhere else. So doesn't that prove clearly that when the Torah prohibits demolition for future construction, it doesn't matter where you're going to be reconstructing the house, even if it's in a different place entirely, because that's what they were doing in the desert. They were reconstructing their house in a totally different place. I think when it has a difference, because the Torah says they traveled at Hashem's command, they camped at Hashem's command, and so it's as if they were doing it in the same place. It's a cryptic answer. It's not exactly clear what that means. We're having a technical discussion about the definition, the guidelines for demolition, and we obviously are on the laws of Shabbos. It was Naftali Chup who said, you think about it in the following way. If you have a 2-year-old running around, where is he? He's here, he's there, he's under the table, on the table, outside, inside. The mother takes him out shopping, the mother puts him for a nap, the mother carries him, Where's the 3-month-old? In the mother's arms. Right? It's always in the same spot. So what the Gemara is telling us is that the Jews were not taking something place and else. They were always in the same place. They were traveling with Hashem and Hashem's commands. They never really moved anywhere. They were always in the same spot. Right? And that's much of the message. If we kind of zoom out and look at the entire story of the Jews in the desert, and for 40 years, so it says that they had food that fell down from heaven every morning. It was a miracle every single morning. And every single morning you had to collect a certain amount. And every single morning, if you collected too much, you came every Friday, no matter how much you tried to collect, you came back with a double portion for Shabbos. And every Shabbos you didn't come back with anything. And any time that you tried to save anything from the next day, it didn't last. So there was this continuous experience where the Jews were taught not through scholarly discussions and not through any philosophical analysis, just by literally experiencing what they ate for breakfast, lunch, and supper every day. This experience of complete dependence on Hashem. And apparently, it wasn't enough to teach them the lesson once or twice, or for a week, or for a year. For 40 years of this, every time that it wasn't such an eventful time. We're used to thinking about this 40 years of wandering. They point out, and it becomes clear as we read later, they spent about half the time was in one spot. 19 years. Another 19 years, they traveled the grand total of like an average of one place per year, I think. That's 38 years.
I have your notes.
Oh, yeah.
20 places, 19 years in one place, 19 years traveling, approximately every 6 months.
Okay, everything.
38 years of wandering.
Right. And the few events that happened. So one of the things it's interesting, the few events, there was the golden calf, the spies, obviously things that changed the trajectory. The spies was the reason they were in the desert for 40 years. in Parshas Maseh, at the end of the fourth book of the Torah, it lists the various places that they encamped, many of which are not familiar to us, and the Torah doesn't describe what happened there. One of the commentaries, I think it's based on a medrash, but basically says that if you read the name, one of them that comes from Charada, which means trembling. And there are other names, the whole about 42 different stops. The name signified the different experiences the Jews had. So trembling means it was a place where they experienced fear and trepidation. There were other names that were happier sounding. Basically, the Jews named the places. It was almost like a travelogue. There were places where things went well, and they were contented, and they were happy and optimistic. In places where things did not go well, and they were worried and distressed and in fear of divine retribution. In other words, in real time, they experienced this clear relationship between their behavior and how they experience Hashem's goodness. Right? That's really what it is. We say that, getting back to that thought from before, the fullest expression of our connection with Hashem is Hashem showering His goodness upon us. That is what Hashem is. That is what He wants to do. That is what He does. When we experience anything other than that, it's simply because our filters are blocking us Hashem's goodness in a way that doesn't feel like this. Largely because we are incapable of receiving His goodness in a more direct fashion. It's all His goodness. When His goodness comes to us in a form that doesn't feel good, and it doesn't mean that we point to other people or even to ourselves and say, I know this happened because of that. But in a general sense, that is always the case. Right? Hashem created a perfect world and filled it with perfect goodness. And it's only the blessings that are created. Again, we look at it all in terms of, since everything is good, there is nothing that's really bad. So badness simply means a less perfect ability on our part to experience Hashem's goodness in its fullest state at this time. So Ramchal says that everything we say Hashem Echad, God is one, everything that happens serves the purpose of bringing Hashem's plan to fruition, bringing a world into the world, bringing the perfection of the world to reality. And even things that seem to be the very opposite of that in every way are simply a more roundabout way of getting Hashem's desired result in some as extreme as possible. In some way, and this is what we believe. If we don't believe this, then we're not expressing perfect faith as Jews. In some way, and we can say this because it's just the most extreme example. It was absolutely impossible to understand, but we don't show from things that we can't understand. We say, the fact that we don't understand something is a limitation of us, not a limitation of Hashem. So what we're saying is nothing happens that isn't from Hashem and that isn't good. When something seems not good, it simply means that Hashem's goodness is not being fully Anyway, okay, so what happens is an experience of Hashem's goodness in some way. So the Jews in that time were living with that awareness because they saw, they experienced how as they traveled, each stop had its own experience. Some were places where they were spiritually on the, like a kid comes home, did you have a good day in school or a bad day in school? The kid does, I had a good day in school. I got I got a prize. I had a bad day. I got a note home. Kind of you get feedback in real time. They had that, and what was interesting is right. Okay, so it's Rabbeinu Bachi says everything depended on the thoughts of the Jews vis-a-vis Hashem when they were righteous and fulfilling His will, and they traveled from bad thoughts to good thoughts in the positive direction. The Hashem's attribute of mercy would protect them and shelter them. That's Har Shafar, a beautiful mountain. Miska, sweetness. When they sinned and they traveled from good to bad, so God's attribute of justice would punish them. Charada, trembling, dafka, banging, mara, bitterness. That's why it says in the Yerushalmi, when the Jews complained that those incidents where they were expressing themselves negatively, they had night watchmen circling the camp because they were afraid of the night terrors. Meaning, as they traveled, depending on their mentality, their mindset, they would either experience sort of positive or negative feedback from Hashem. So these were people who had experienced immediate feedback on their behavior, and they experienced clearly and directly how Hashem's presence was felt commensurate with their own deeds. Whenever they sinned, they feared Hashem's justice because they knew the consequences would be quick and evident. And they named the places that they visited based on these experiences, which begs a powerful question. Why were they sinning at all? I mean, if it was so obvious to them, and we always say that Hashem does not make the consequences of our behavior so clear and evident because otherwise we wouldn't have free will. And it seems like the feedback was evident and forthcoming and clear to them. So then why do they make so many mistakes? And so we see that this is the nature of human beings, the power of the Yetzer Hara, and really the power of free will. That it's and probably like in all cases, we're often aware. You say, well, if we know that what we're doing, there's room for improvement, why don't we just improve? But it's not so simple because we know, as in the Social Shalom says, we know it in a general sense. We know the concept, but we always miss the application. Right? So if we knew for a fact, like we know we shouldn't speak Lashon Hara, but if we knew that you're going to have a conversation on the telephone with so and so about such and such, and you're going to want to say this, but that's Lashon Hara, then we probably wouldn't say it. But instead, we know that we shouldn't speak negatively, which is true. And then we're having a conversation with so and so about such and such, and there isn't any sign that says that's Lashon Hara. There's just a conversation. So until our brain catches up, it usually catches up the second the words leave our mouth, and then all of a sudden we catch. But until then, the Yetzer Hara had this power. And in the same sense, the Jews were traveling through the desert, and they could feel and they could sense things weren't going well, but the Yetzer Hara still. Free will is free will. So we often think that our challenges as people of free choice is that the world is we live in such a secular world, we live in a world with so many challenges, the world in Hashem's. They lived in a world where Hashem was not very hidden, and it was about as open and obvious as it could be, and they still had free will and they still made mistakes. So it teaches us a lesson again and again what will ultimately determine our behavior is going to be our free will. And obviously, when Hashem's presence is more hidden, our free will may be exercised in different areas. We're not expected to live on the same level that they live. The challenges that we have wouldn't have been challenges for them, and they wouldn't have made the mistakes we made, but they had their own mistakes that they made. But the mistakes came from the same reason, that despite knowing what's right, when a real life situation presents itself, we have this amazing ability to not draw the connection between what we know is right and between our behavior in the moment. That's a lesson that we constantly have to relearn. So, on the one hand, if we're aware that Hashem is traveling with us, or if we are aware that Hashem is carrying us, we're always in the same spot. But we can also literally be surrounded by Hashem's presence and complain and forget, obviously on their level. These were very subtle errors, they weren't egregious errors. But there's no guarantee that we're going to remember or be mindful in the moment when the challenge presents itself. We can still do the wrong thing, we can still make the wrong choice. So it's true that when you travel with Hashem, you're always in the same spot, but primarily what's important is not how Hashem is carrying you, because He always is, but it's how you perceive Hashem carrying you. Because even if you live in a world like we do, if we look at it with we don't have to open our eyes that wide. We can see that Hashem is carrying us. It's very clear. And the issue is more because of our readiness to see it more than the actual circumstances. Yes, we don't have open miracles, but we have enough hidden miracles. So we read about this so many places, so many svarim, that there are enough hidden miracles that surround us that we can experience just as they did, the sense that Hashem is surrounding us. And if we do that, we'll feel Hashem's presence. And if we don't need to, and we're not privy to have that kind of feedback that they had, where we can see a direct correlation between our actions and the consequences. That's not something, and they lived on a higher level, and they had a greater awareness for that reason, and more was expected of them for that reason. But we don't need that. That's what our rabbis tell us, that all we need to know, and when we wake up in the morning, we say Rodani, and we say the brachos, we declare wholeheartedly that we see and feel that Hashem is laying the ground up beneath our feet, Hashem is opening our eyes and untying our limbs and giving us clothing. So we're basically saying we feel like the Jews in the desert, that Hashem is providing us these things every day, which is the reality. And the Torah makes it clear that the lesson took them 40 years to learn the lesson, but once they learned it, it's supposed to carry over to us as well. So we have the ability to place ourselves in that mindset and to feel that we're traveling with Hashem, we're surrounded by His presence, and whatever we do is directly influenced. Again, can we draw an exact correlation? Do we get that feedback? No, we have to rely on guidance of the Torah, we have to rely on our own introspection. But
didn't Hashem tell us that the Exodus, the miracles in Egypt, was only going to be a one-time?
Yeah, well, that's the point. The miracles are only a one-time thing. They teach certain lessons that are supposed to be permanent, that we can reflect. We're supposed to think about those miracles to keep those lessons alive. And apparently, we don't need to have them every time. That's the point. Once the lessons are taught, we have them with us, and we can refer back to the events, and we also have the actual experiences that become part of our spiritual DNA, and that's enough for us. So there's still work to be done, but the work is the same work that they had to do. Even those people who did experience the miracles, that's what we see. There had to be a conscious decision to keep those lessons alive, because when they didn't, there were times that they were complaining, and there was a bitterness and fear and Amalek and all these different things that they contended with when they themselves didn't keep the lessons alive. So even those people who actually went through it were just as capable, not just as capable, they were capable of remembering or forgetting, depending on what they chose. We're also capable of remembering and forgetting. We shouldn't feel, it's not the circumstances that define our choices. Circumstances create the framework for our choices, but we choose what we choose to do. And we have this ability. If we do that, we'll always be in the right place. We'll always know that we're going in the right direction. The